Good afternoon, everyone. Actually, it's only the three of us. Good afternoon, Tim and Bernard. Thanks for joining. Let's wait for people to rally, and we'll get started probably in 2 to 3 minutes, depending on how many people there are. In the meantime, here's the agenda. While we're waiting 2 or 3 more minutes, if there's anything you'd like to add, just edit or ping me on the Slack or on the meeting chat, and I'll happily adjust the agenda. Okay, 3 minutes in, let's get started. Thank you everyone for joining. So this is the SIG meeting, January 22nd. So the agenda is going to be as follows. First, quick housekeeping item, and then we're going to go through the working group updates. There is a lot actually for working group 1 and 3 updates. Karen, thank you for leading the meeting last week, and I'll give you the floor there. And then there are a couple of things that I'd like also to get the group over. And then cookies to close off the meeting. Any agenda item someone would like to add or discuss today that is not captured in the agenda? All right, so everyone, I'll be unavailable starting this Wednesday until mid-Feb. Personal leave. Anyway, I'm going on vacation for what it's worth. Everybody can know that. So I won't be available basically to chair or co-chair our meetings, whether it's this one or the other meetings that we have related to scoping and architecture. And so for that, I'm going to work with Sana, that I think is back, so it's good. And that way we'll be able to achieve a continuity in what we started. Any comment
Hi,
on that?
Hi, Alexi. Hi, everybody else.
Oh, hey, Sana, thank you. Do you wanna go and run some of these? I was just at the housekeeping telling that I'm going to be away and that we're going to work together to ensure continuity on what we started while I'm away.
All good, Alexi. We'll sync up after the meeting as well so that we can continue to run these calls effectively. I'm good if you're running through the housekeeping stuff. I'm around. I'll catch up with the comments here.
Sweet. Okay, so I assume there is no question in there. So let's jump straight into the working group updates, right? So Karen, I captured, I think, what are the main minutes or outcome from the meeting that you were able to run for us last Friday. I don't know if you want to give maybe a quick rundown of the gist of it?
Yeah, I can do, and I think it's good. I see at least Tal and Vim and a few others from that call on Friday are here today, so they can correct anything I misrepresent. But I think effectively what you pasted in the chat there is more or less what or in the agenda is more or less what I pasted in the chat on Friday.
Yes, I copy pasted it.
Yeah, which is more or less the minutes that I took from there. So I think first of all, there was a little bit of misunderstanding going into the meeting as to why it was sort of RX and architecture in the meeting title. My understanding of that was that the rationale being that yourself and Sana had set up a single meeting to cover the two topics from Working Group 1 and Working Group 3. You were planning, I think, to allocate 30 minutes to each topic in that meeting. And that was on the basis that there's not enough time in the day or the week in order to run multiple meetings with your limited time. So
yeah, I think so that's absolutely accurate.
So once I think that was over the hump, then we need finally, I think there was a feeling amongst the collective in the meeting that there was a need to have a charter for both working groups 1 and 3 in order to understand what the purpose and intent was. We said we would bring this up in this meeting to discuss, and that,
yes.
And that we also felt, I think the second part of that was that that the working group on Friday, that meeting should explicitly include members of the other SIGs in order to ensure that any sort of requirements planning was acceptable in the other SIGs as well. So maybe, right. Yeah, so I think you just want, yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, sorry, I've been interrupting you, Karen. Go ahead.
No, it's fine. I think you were just about to click into what was the actual existing charter. So maybe that's a good, good point to take this topic item.
Yes, this is where I wanted to go, absolutely, because we tried to, if you recall, we ordered a little bit the drive, and then we came up, I extracted the working group role and responsibilities as part of the following document, but I just extracted it that existed before. And that document should be the quote unquote the charter or what you're calling the charter, I believe, in terms of defining the role and responsibilities, and most specifically the function and the contributors. And for the RX scope, it's already captured that SIG 2 and 3 are required to be there, or that we'd like them to be there. This is a SIG 1 call, so SIG 1 is not spelled out, but it's obvious given it's a SIG 1 call. Or at least that was the intention when I updated this document. It might be missing information, and if it does, so actually no, let me rephrase, take that back. So Karen, based on the discussion Friday, is this missing information that we should add or massage a bit?
Yeah, I think there was a lack of clarity between when we look at working group 1, it says defining the medium and long-term architecture, including I think there was a roadmap up there, I thought. Yes, so on the title under name, it says architecture and long-term roadmap, and then working group 3 is kind of the RX scope and user stories. So there's kind of an overlap there in terms of what is the roadmap, what is an architecture, an architectural roadmap versus the sort of the user stories and the release scope, and where does that overlap start and end?
Yeah, so I can make
Karen,
it very clear.
Okay, go ahead, Alexi. I have some thoughts because I have some background coming from why we are running one meeting for these two. So the RX scope and user stories, as you all well understand, is basically the planning for the next release. And the audience for this particular RX scope and planning should be SIG 1, SIG 2, SIG 3, because when we are trying to describe the user stories and try to create the theme for the next release, everyone should be on the same page. Everyone should actually contribute to the ideas and what's feasible, what's not. So that was the idea behind working group 3, RX scope and user stories. Now, in some of our discussions, it did come around that we need to keep some of the user stories for this release, and we need to defer some of these to the future releases. So some of that discussion does help you brainstorm to look at the long-term picture, which actually goes into the SIG working group 1, which is the roadmap. And I'm just trying to show you one more interaction why SIG working group 1 and working group 3 are sometimes related, is because when you're trying to show these user stories for the next release, there is sometimes a back architecture that shows the component diagram and it shows how the user stories would flow through the components of your nephew architecture. So every time we were trying to take this in isolation, one activity, like for example, planning the release for the user stories for the next release, discussion on the design and architecture would come in. So I think it made a lot of sense that we couple these two meetings together, focus on the RX planning and try to bring up the user stories, but keep in mind that there's an evolving architecture for our discussion, which made sense to just put together in one meeting. And I hope, Karen, this is making sense to you and everybody else. But besides the conflicting time situation that me and Alexi were trying to sort out, there were another compelling reason to just put them together for some time. And because we also were looking for the same audience to actually contribute into these discussions.
I think that makes sense to me anyway, and others who are in the meeting on Friday, chip in if you have an opinion. I guess some of that, and there is an overlap obviously between the activities, and that overlap isn't necessarily going to be 100% crystal clear all the time.
Well, I can put it differently. Working group 3 is a very tactical working group that we leverage to build a specific release scope, whereas working group 1 is really the forward-looking vision for Nephew. So meaning it's current architecture, but it's long-term roadmap.
Right.
So to put it differently.
And Alexi, we could even do that. Sorry, go ahead.
Well, what I was going to finish is to put it differently. As part of the working group 1 long-term roadmap, we're going to define probably some set of use cases or some set of requirements that we'd like to see. But these will only materialize as part of a specific release that will be defining the scope, and that's going to be part of what the working group 3 will do. So this is, all of that is completely new because we never functioned that way until now. And that's, I think, the premise of what is that, responsibility and role for these two working groups. If it doesn't make sense or should be adjusted, I think we could, but that's the initial intention.
I agree, Alexi. We can get to the questions. I think Wim and Ravi has questions. Just to top up on what Alexi said, I think completely aligned with Alexi's thought because we decided to do it this way for some time. I think, Alexi, in the short term, we can completely focus on the RX planning, which is the R3 planning at the moment, and keep the meeting cadence as is. And once we are slightly out of the door for that discussion, we could continue to pick up the topics on the long-term roadmap discussion, look at the long-term roadmap and architectural diagrams at that time and continue to evolve on that. So basically we could use the different events of that meeting at different times to focus on different working groups activities. And maybe that's one way to help address some of the thoughts and problems here.
Ravi, I think you are the first.
Yeah, so in the last Friday's call, there was this discussion on kind of start sharing user stories, right, for discussion during on the Friday's call. But then we have not kind of lined up these use case stories to this long-term roadmap. If my understanding is right, then we say, okay, these are the set of use case stories coming from these 4 working groups. And we do this due diligence of saying what might be in the scope of R3, R4, R5, and so on, and just take the R3s for the Friday's call, right? So
yeah, and
I
hold on to that thought.
That step might be missing here. So
no, well, yeah, hold on to that thought, okay? And I'm sorry, I'm jumping a lot of things. Sudi shared this Friday, and you discussed this. What was missing is the user story input, okay? So these are the main 3 release goals at high level, and then I put all the user stories that we have produced until now. So a couple of other raised hands, but this is just we're at the beginning of the process, right? So please, let us set things in motion before we expect things that we didn't have the time to put in place. But that's a good point, Ravi, though.
Yeah, no, there was already a call for sharing this. That's why I was bringing this point. So, anyways, yeah. So I think I think everybody understands what I'm getting at. Thanks.
Thanks, Ravi. Wim.
Yeah, so I mean, so we have this balance between, I would say, short term, or let's call it next release, versus long term, right? And I think if you make what I raised as a potential, let's say, way of working is that would it not make sense that we, let's say, whether the user story is short term or longer term, at the end of the day, shouldn't really matter. Although there is a bit of, given that we have this cadence of every release at every 6 months today from an FAO point of view, right now there's a bit of urgency to help define the R3, let's say, scope. And so as a way of working, or what I was proposing in the meeting is, let's bring up the user stories that we believe should be applicable, and let's review them to see what is the implications on the system in order to figure out what are the building blocks that we need to update or add or change. It's the same as update, to go to the next phase, right? What I'm trying to get to is there is this dilemma, if you will, of short versus long term, and then prioritizing that potentially depending on all of that, right? And this has to do with the way our releases work. And some people, I believe, felt a bit more uncomfortable with that. But I think that's the challenge that we have, is that we have this cadence at every 6 months on one hand, and on the other hand, you have this long-term thing that you want to accomplish. And yeah.
Right. So we'll, I think right now we need to solve the short term very quickly, and we need to start reviewing the user stories. But I think the intention was to make sure that this fits a higher level long-term view, which sorry, I couldn't watch the recording of Friday call yet, but anyway, I think that's clear, Wim, and we want to work that out for the very short term at least. And I have a proposal on how to work to go through all these user stories one by one, and some of concrete things on how we can break down these user stories into actionable tasks. So I'll share some of that in a couple of minutes.
Okay.
I think it was Karen or Tal. I missed who's next. One or the other.
I think it was me, but yeah, I mean, I think it's kind of the analogy I've used a few times is we're trying to bolt the wings in the plane as it's taking off. But I think what you're sort of suggesting there and what Wim is saying, I think is more or less we agreed on Friday that we were going to sort of maybe use the next session anyway, to be more operational in terms of breaking down the existing user stories that we've already defined and putting them into some kind of anatomy with dependencies and kind of a construction plan. That gives us the breathing space then to start to do more of the longer term planning if we've got enough of a near-term roadmap laid out so that, you know, there's development can continue, then we can work in the longer term anatomy to make sure that we're actually flying the plane in the right direction. So something along those lines. I think that makes sense to me anyway.
Yes, thank you, Karen. Tal?
So yeah, Wim is correct that I'm uncomfortable. The 6-month cadence in open source projects of this scope is always difficult. I think people have been in other projects would agree. So I want to suggest 2 constructive ways maybe to help here. One is, let's make sure to write R3 plus everywhere to remind us that we're planning for the future here, and every single line item is its own story, right? Well, literally it's a user story, but I mean it has its own scope, right? Some user stories are big, some are smaller, some might take more work in FAO, some already have all the features in place. So what I would suggest is that per user story, we break it down, make it more digestible. So always start with a POC. That's one rule that I want to propose. So every user story has a POC just to see that the user story is even possible with what we have and to learn what the challenges are. You know, is there a missing feature, for example, observability, policy framework, etc. So every single one of these can be broken down. Some of these could happen in the next release, R3. Some of these will have to wait for R4. Some might even have to wait for R5. I don't know. But if we break each one of these into smaller, more digestible pieces in terms of planning, then it will help us all get there. Yeah, that's my
I
suggestion.
think. Thanks.
Alexi, I would also like to come back to Tol on that because a couple of questions. Question number one, Tol, the 6 months cadence. Are we saying that we should not follow the 6 months release cycle? Because it's probably a TSC level discussion, right? Which can be taken in a different call. And of course, we can make that decision. But every 6 months, because the marketing happens, we have to have a story, we have to publish something, we have to make that open source presence about the progress every 6 months. So however we execute the process internally and whatever we consume and accomplish within that, I think that's a different question. So that's one question to your question.
Yeah, I just want to say, yeah, I don't want to get into that here. I kind of think the 6 month cadence is just a given. I don't see the TSC changing that. However, we can work within it in different ways, right? A less of a waterfall approach. The main reason here is I'm trying to protect our developers, right? This is the second release where we have a big crunch of a lot of work having to happen kind of in the last 3 months of it, because there's always seems to be 3 months in which we're not working within the 6 month cadence. So I think we just need to make this more rolling. I don't want to use the word agile because it has whole manifestos and philosophy behind it, but we need to make this less of a crunch and more about when the release date comes, we release what we have, but we want to make sure that we have things, right? That it's not a release with nothing. So yeah, I think the best way, as Alexis said too, we just have to start brainstorming each of these. But I think, again, if we break each one of these user stories into more digestible pieces, there's a higher chance that something will make it into the next release, R3 or R4. Right. So the plus sign is important for me.
So one more question before we move on to the following questions. Karen also has a raised hand. So the Friday's meeting, I haven't looked at the distribution of the audience who were actually present, but I think the discussions that Tol is having to break it down into smaller pieces to be able to decide that which one's candidate for a POC, which one's candidate for R3, which is going beyond. I think that discussion has to happen in the RX planning meeting on Friday. And we have to have the right participation in that meeting who can brainstorm, who can decide that that subset is short term, we can pick it up right now, and the other subset is going into the longer term. So the rest of the team can start focusing on the short term subset of the user stories, or however we are breaking it down. So the first question is that, do we have the right audience on the RX planning meeting on every Friday or not? If not, we need to socialize that and make sure that we have the right representation who can focus on the next release discussion, taking it from a POC level, taking it to the operationalizing level, and people are actually aligned and taking the best use of that forum.
So, I mean, Karen, I know you have your hand raised. I'll let you talk in a minute. Just to reset everyone's expectation, we only had 2 of these meetings. Okay, so it's not like we've been running with this forever. We only had 2. The first one, we focused on the architecture discussion, and the second one, I believe, was more focused on the release goal. So we're far from yet having a good understanding, and yet we're already trying to throw in various aspects that on the process. But so I'd like for us to set up a little bit the ways of working before saying it doesn't work. And I agree that I think I've heard that fear, Tal, of being bound to a scope or a date a lot of times, to you and from others. And I think by no point in time, our goal is to say there is a cutoff date or it needs to be that. I agree with you. It's going to, whatever is there the day of the release, that's what we get, and we can write release notes with the proper disclaimers. So I'm 100% with you there. So I see a comment from, well, Karen, maybe go ahead with your comment, but yeah, and I'll go with my next point right after. Go ahead, Karen.
Right. Alexei, to finish that thought, one last comment. I know only 2 meetings have happened, but I'm basically alluding to a more fundamental problem that we have to have the right representation of the audience on that call, because SIG 1 is producing all that information and content, and SIG 2 has to continuously receive that. And I know we have some representation of SIG 2 already here, Wim's here, Tall's here, and of course, whoever needs to be here will be here. But the point is that they need to constantly absorb information and constantly take it back into the SIG 2 action. And it's a question to SIG 2 right now. Is it happening that way, or is it something else that SIG 1 has to do to make sure that it happens?
Yeah, no, I forget to answer that. I think we have the right representation, Sana, on the call.
Okay. Okay.
Karen?
Yeah, so I just wanted, I mean, I guess what I'm hearing is a kind of a more continuous delivery, continuous development flow that Tal at least is looking for, versus the need for some kind of marketing / announcement release is the reason why we have a sort of a 6-monthly cadence in terms of making releases. I wonder, is there any other reason why we need to make a 6-monthly release? Is it purely for a marketing perspective, or is it for things like interface deprecation, if we want to use those as points of time at which we can say, at R4, this interface is deprecated, and at R5, it's removed, for example? That might be other reasons. But other than that, I mean, does it not make more sense to say we have releases in May and November, and those releases pretty much follow like clockwork, and whatever happens to be in the Nefio code base at that point in time is what gets out the door in that release?
Karen, that makes total sense. I think the 6-month releases in the beginning of the TSC decision was just a way for us to make progress. We can bring it up again, and we can review that in the TSC call. I think that's just the intention behind that. The progress and marketing, both things go together, but it doesn't affect the decision of doing it on a continuous CI/CD model, continuously working together, evolving on what's done, and incrementally, constantly working towards the progress in smaller steps. And by the 6 months mark, like Alex mentioned, that if whatever is done, we can put that in the release notes, try to create the theme outside of it, and then do the marketing stuff on the side. So I think that model can completely work, and I don't see a problem working like that with this.
Which is why I was operationally trying to suggest that we use the Friday meeting to build enough of a backlog for developers to have work to work on, rather than saying, and I think Tal, you were saying the same thing, it should be R3 plus, as opposed to saying this is going into R3 and it's definitely an R3.
It was an RX meeting.
Yeah.
So let's call it that way. RX, let's not put the 3 in it, so it avoids all the confusion.
Yeah, okay. And then, I mean, some of these user stories I could see there, you may get some of the capability delivered, but not necessarily all of the capability in a particular release anyway. So
yeah,
yes,
some of that is so big that it's going to be over R4 and R5, like Tal mentioned. So it's all good.
And this is exactly where well, hang on, before I go, Wim, I see your hand raised. No, yeah, Wim.
No, we have at the moment the fact that we have a release every 6 months, or let's say, let's not call it a release or a marketing or whatever event we have. I mean, it's just, I think at the moment we have an operational model around it, and I think we have to change it, right? Because, okay, release 2 is kind of done, right? So now we are discussing release 3, but there is nothing that would have, we could have started the discussion on some of these user stories potentially already in November. So this should have been I think what we are basically discussing, and I have the feeling most people agree, is that this Friday meeting should have been there from the beginning. And I don't think Alex is, we are not discussing it doesn't work. I think we are trying to discuss how to make it work and how we can work it all together and have it clear, because we didn't have something like this. And I think it makes sense. For me, it makes a lot of sense. I think what we are just discussing is an operational model that we are all comfortable with and happy with, and then we can improve from there, right? But so in other words, there's no there is no reason, and nobody dictates for us to basically have a flow right now that release 2 is out. Okay, now we are going to discuss release 3 content. This could be a continuous conversation at the end of the day. But we have today an operational mindset around it, and probably we all have to think a bit differently around this. But I think this Friday meeting potentially helps us to get around that, because if we can go to a model where people can bring in user stories that people want to realize, I think from Susanna, the reason I raised my hand as well is do we have the right audience? But I think it's important then, I think, so at the moment, I have the feeling that from a SIG2, Tal and myself are committed to be in that meeting. But SIG2 is not just Tal and myself, it's actually way more people, right? So what I think is important is to come to an operational model where we say, okay, here is the user story that we discuss, and the relevant people that are interested to contribute and be active in those would be part of that meeting. And that means that the set of people there is not always the same.
Right.
No, I
So
like the
Wim,
idea.
let's find out. Yeah, let's find out the model. Do we extend the meeting invite to additional SIG2 members who can potentially look at this user stories and find the short-term opportunities and say that, let's pick this user story and take it to our own meeting and just turn that into a POC or do something about it?
Yeah. What I would propose, what I was proposing, Sana, is that we have to announce the user story that we have in mind, or the user stories that we have in mind discussing. And I think that will hopefully trigger the right people to be in that meeting.
So could you or Tal identify those user stories and become the ambassadors?
We have to learn how to do that. But for me, what I was proposing already on Friday is, let's say, announce the user story, not say the day before, but let's say a couple of days before, and then stream that through the relevant SIGs, right? That can even be SIG3, in my view, has to be there from my perspective. That we make it visible that is the piece that we are going to discuss or refine or whatever.
Yeah.
And as a result, that would trigger the necessary people to be involved, because I don't believe it's a fixed set of people. There has to be, I said it already, the relevant people for that particular user.
So they will show up on that meeting.
Yeah. So if I may, tactically speaking, we'll have to have one meeting for ORAN, one meeting for SDK, one meeting for a UI, and one meeting for user story service assurance. And I think these can be, we can use the Friday meeting, or it can happen, outside of the Friday's meeting if people can regroup. But that's how I would see this going. But before getting there, what I really want to get at some point is, because we're asking, how to break down these user stories. Because if, I don't know if I can move on. I see some still hand raised, sorry. So, okay, let's go with the hand raise. In 3 minutes, I'd like to move on to a similar kind of item, but just different discussion point. Bala.
Yeah, thanks. First of all, this is very good. It's a huge progress. So from a SIG1 perspective, my expectation was, like they will define the priorities. They will define these are the features they're looking for. And then probably if you want to break down, probably that's more of an execution thing. That's more of a SIG2 in my view. I don't think we need to break down any further than this. It's actually already broken down in my view in terms of a user story perspective. So the one other thing from a guidance perspective, obviously we know all these things will not fit into a release. There's some multi-release items, but they're all required from the release perspective. So from a SIG1 perspective, if you can define the priorities, these are the highest priority items for our next release because of the market reasons, because of the story reasons, because stories, and when I say, I'm not saying storytelling, it's about storytelling, because this is where the nephew is heading. This is where the opportunities are. This is where we are filling the gaps. So if SIG1 can define those priorities, this is given everything in the next 6 months release, which is R3, we would like to see these top items. When I say these top items, it need not be, obviously, it is from multiple themes. It need not be only from ORAN, or it could be all the stories from ORAN, or it could be stories from different items. But at this point of time, if SIG1 can present the wish list, let's say I want these 3 stories from ORAN, these 3 stories from STK, and these 2. This is my absolute top priority items for the release. And then the rest of the stories can fall into the subsequent releases. At that point of time, SIG2 can look at those things. It's actually well written at this point of time, user stories, and then look at the capacity, look at the historical perspective in terms of how much was delivered in terms of work, and SIG2 and SIG3 can combine together. At that point of time, they can negotiate with SIG1. I know you want this 6 stories for or 3, but we can only do 4, something like that. I think that was my mental map of how this would work out.
Yeah, Balaji,
Not
thank you so much
not
for
leaving everything
bringing
on
this.
SIG1 to break down
Right.
all the stories and all
Right.
those things. I think that's too much.
Right, right. Bala, I would really like to come back to what you suggested, because I think a very important exercise for us is to also the demarcation of the SIG and the responsibilities of the SIG.
Yeah.
Based on my former understanding, thanks Bala for bringing this up, my understanding was the role of SIG1 is to basically come up with user stories in a specific template and socialize that with SIG2. I think the socializing platform is that meeting, the RX scope and planning meeting that is on Fridays. So once we present these user stories and socialize that, we are taking an additional action item that we should also prioritize that. From SIG1 perspective, we believe that these user stories are of significant relevance to a lot of service providers. And from our perspective, that's the priority. And our priority might not be final, but at least it's a wish list. And once we provide that input to SIG2, it's the job of SIG2 to break it down, to take it internally within their SIGs, to decide which ones they want to pick up in which order, and bring back the information in the same meetings that we are having on Fridays, so that we have a real-time view of how the evolution of these user stories is happening towards a given release. And that doesn't have to have all the details, but at least a high-level view on these user stories are picked up and in progress. So then we can continue to catch up on that.
Yeah, absolutely. And at which point of time, SIG2 and SIG3 combined can come back and say, I absolutely love the list, but we can only fit in, out of 6 stories, we can only fit in, say, 4 or 5 stories for the release. That's also negotiation.
Right. And we keep bringing on new stories. We keep updating the priorities. It has to be an evolutionary process, and it will be in a document. The document will always be socialized, and we'll keep bringing that in the forum. That is the RX planning and release meeting every Friday. So this becomes a more continuous process. It doesn't have to have one meeting, right?
Absolutely.
Yeah, yes. I agree with that, Bala. I have already taken the action. I have updated that on the board, Alexi, that we have to show the priorities of these user stories. So that would be an additional input to SIG2 from SIG1. The user stories in the right template with the right priorities, and that's the demarcation point.
Yes. Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay,
Thanks,
sounds good.
Yeah.
Tim.
So I just want to say 2 things. I'm not going to try to reiterate all this stuff. One of them is, as we talked about last Friday, user stories themselves can come in at when they're ready, right? So be careful about creating a meeting for ORAN and a meeting for whatever, and a meeting for whatever, because the user stories may not all be done at the same time. They're going to trickle in. I got like 2 ready now, and maybe 2 in the next week, and all that stuff. Okay, so that's one point, right? So just make sure that this is a trickling piece, right? The other thing, just to let you know, I've done it. I don't know if that made sense or not, but what I have done in the ORAN group is, prior to even finishing these or presenting these stories in the RX scope, I asked the group if there are commitments to do the work, right, in it. So I'm getting user commitments for the work going prior to, because I think that's information that you need to know. The user story doesn't do you any good unless you can get it down into the code, right? So anyway, those are the 2 things that I was doing. Don't try to treat them all with one big block. And you may very well want to ask, coming in, at least ask the question if there's a commitment in terms of development towards that user story.
Agreed, team. I think we will agree that things needs to be more of a rolling mechanism than a one-stop kind of shoot or miss.
Right. Alexi, I'm converging on some of the ideas that we discussed before we move on to the next item, of course, on our list. I believe the Friday's meeting, we can socialize the existing evolving document of the user stories 2 days prior to the meeting. But I think we should not focus on the specific user stories on ORAN or the assurance working group or the modeling working group in that meeting. Because right now we have a bulk of user stories to discuss and we haven't made decisions. But as we continue to make progress with those meetings, maybe for every new meeting, we have only 2 fresh user stories to take a look at and establish priorities and for them to review. And that meeting could stay general. For any specific discussions on any one user story and for digging down into the details, I think we could have a breakout meeting and a specific group of developers and people who actually develop the story could come together, brainstorm more and exchange more information if needed. Maybe that would be a model that can scale better with that meeting.
Okay.
It's my proposal. I'm not making a decision.
Well, I think the intention is really to iterate on the actual content of these user stories, right? And from that enable SIG2 jointly with the user stories owner to define what are the tasks required. I don't want to throw the work over and SIG2 define the task. Of course, probably that's what's happening, but SIG1 still needs to be involved to some extent, I believe. And that's where these Friday calls, I view them as more of a collaboration calls where we define. And that's where I want to go with my exact next point. So, because we have these user stories, when someone is going to say, hey, my user story is ready for review, let's have it as part of the agenda for Friday call. I'm going to suggest something. I don't know if we want to go with this, we can ignore it, but I was trying to come up with how to digest the user stories, right? Of course, so review user stories, each working group are owning that, they can do it, but then for us to jointly do it, what's functional, non-functional, brainstorm on the tasks, what are the implementation tasks that I need, and then create a task list. Is there any sequence of these tasks? And then, so look, the guys that has done product management are probably very familiar with all these things. I won't go over all these 11 points, but I tried to put a very light, maybe it's 11 points, so it's not light to some people, but my point is to help drive the discussion in the Friday meeting. When we take a user stories, we go and look at some of these things that we care about, like task dependencies, testing requirement. And don't forget that we set the expectation for all the user stories to come up with already 4 kind of artifacts, right? So it's not like they're coming at the meeting without already a lot of work being done for that.
Yeah.
co-SIG.
Yeah, once again, to establish a little bit of the demarcation between the roles of the SIG. Of course, it's a collaborative effort, but the role of the SIG has to have some boundary. I would expect, it's my view, that this document that you showed should come from SIG2. We should review it together. We should see it together. We should still share our ideas with them. But the work effort, the work estimate, breaking down into the tasks, the sequence of tasks, this document against a given user story should come from SIG2.
Yeah, and I don't 100% disagree.
Agree with. Okay, perfect.
I don't disagree. It's just the document never existed, so I tried to.
It's a wonderful way of establishing communication, but I think that's exactly where we can sense the SIG2's prospect about a given user story, and we can better understand that my priority 1 or 2 is it justifiable or not. Oh, because of the effort index around this user story, it makes total sense that this could be deferred to the next release, but we can still work on it. So I think I really like that communication model, but I expect this particular response to be coming from SIG2, if Tol and Wim agree to that.
Well, Wim has it sign raised, so maybe let's go to Wim.
Okay. Of course, yeah.
Yeah, I basically had to. I mean, yeah, I do agree that the breakdown of the impact should probably come from SIG2, right? Or should come from SIG2. The second thing that I was going to why I raised my hand actually was we should not use the Friday meeting to get an understanding of the use case. The Friday meeting should be, because those use cases should have been prioritized and vetted out, right? So I think the understanding of the use case should have been, let's say, understood before the meeting. The goal of the Friday meeting for me is more to understand this breakdown, or to basically discuss, let's say, how do we, let's say, show this use case, or how will we test this, and which components do we need to impact? So basically what you were referring to in the document, Alexis, more or less, right? Or the points that you highlighted here. I think I just wanted to highlight, at least that's my view of the Friday meeting. We should avoid trying to understand the use case, because otherwise we will have another meeting just to understand the use case without actually making progress towards the implications of it.
Yeah, I agree. I think that's why we came up with that list of artifacts, because we want the Friday meeting to look at these artifacts and identify, and then eventually, build something like this. But yeah, it should be based on the artifact, not the understanding of the use case itself. I agree.
Right. So two things, Alexi. The user story is already well understood, and the proof for that would be that every working group would already have drafted the user story in a format which is following the template, as well as provided these additional artifacts with the user story. And once that user story is complete, I think then it becomes a candidate for bringing up in the RX planning meeting on Friday. So I think that's already taken into the process and well understood, I think. And I think
Yes.
one additional part that we want to add, Alexi, is the priority level. I think we can socialize that with the working group side. How do we assign the priority level? Maybe it's a different discussion.
No, but that's something I'm engaged in the ORAN working group, and I can tell you it's already part of the discussion there. So I was expecting the working group themselves to come up with a list of priority to SIG1.
Yeah, I agree. And once we as chairs receive the user stories from working groups with the priority levels, we can bucket the priorities one for given user stories. We can reshuffle them and see which ones are priority one, which ones are two, and we can receive that feedback.
So I don't want to. Okay, we have 3 hand raised, but there is another point that I think require probably the last 10 minutes. So maybe Bala, Karen, Bernard, we can go fast on
Yes,
what you want to talk about.
Yes, I'll go real fast. So I think Sana already said what I wanted to say. So what I wanted to say was, once you define the user story with a priority, and then let's say SIG2 wants to take it, and it will define those tasks instead of a document. We will define those. I mean, basically, when I say SIG2 and SIG3 will work in tandem to define a particular task and dependencies and all those things. Instead of doing it in a documentation, we'll do it directly as a GitHub issue, so that we can map the user story from SIG1 to the tasks that are defined by SIG2 and SIG3, so that we can present them together. This is your wish list from SIG1. Yes, that's what I wanted to say.
Yeah, agreed.
Good. Yeah, that's all.
Thank you, Bala. Karen?
Just a quick one that I raised on the Slack a couple of, I think it was last week or the week before, about some things that don't fall neatly into the bucket of the existing working groups. So where would we bring a user story, such as the specific example would be registering a pre-existing cluster? Where would we bring that to if it doesn't already have a working group?
General.
Maybe that. Is there a working group for general?
No, general is this meeting, this group.
Okay, fine. So we'll create a Jira then, or not a Jira, sorry, that's my internal head coming out. A GitHub issue then for something we would propose and then review it in this meeting. Is that the way we would do that?
I would suggest that, yes, Karen.
Okay, sounds good.
Thank you. Okay, thank you all. I mean, this is a great discussion, and I'm glad we're having it. I think it's not done completely, but the intention was to say that we tried to come up with a couple of documents. Of course, we don't want to be overwhelmed with documents, also, although we might feel we are. That process document here that I built is to be used or not. It's really up to SIG2 if you want to leverage that. Let me be very honest. I even created a slide deck but the reality is I use AI to generate the deck for me, so I didn't write anything in there. But I think it's good enough that it can be leveraged if needed. So I'll stop with this. I want to go really to my last point. Well, it's not the last of the agenda, but one of the important points that I want to review is the following. So Bernard and we had an offline discussion, and we wanted to bring that to the broader working SIG here. Right now, we're talking about the scope, which is key, and I think probably top of mind. But there is another area where we believe we need to come up with documents, and probably normative documents, like documents that we released as part of a release. And some of these documents could encompass high-level process descriptions. So if you recall, I think for the first two releases, the various contributors provided a user stories proposal. Right now, we displayed the user story proposal that was done by, I think, Bernard and the Dutch Telecom Group. But there are a bunch of user story proposals that exist. So let's not ignore them, and let's try to see how, the same way as we're leveraging the scope for release, the higher level pillars, I think there is a lot of things we can do to leverage these user stories proposal and frame what we're delivering in Nefio with them. The second document is more, functional architecture diagram and component. So I think that one we're working on it. It's already captured. The user stories, we're working on it. The sequence diagram is also something we'd like to have. We don't have Eric from Orange, but I believe Eric presented something in R1. If someone is familiar of this, can you please just link it to me on Slack or somewhere? So we have a baseline. And then the schemas, right? What are the models provided? Like what are the APIs or models that we are releasing? So, and of course, I mean, you might see that the 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5 document we want to release there as part of SIG1 or Nefio release are really in line with actually the various components or artifacts that we're requesting on a per user story basis. So it's just to show you that each user stories has their own small view of Nefio, but then there is a broader view of Nefio that is consolidated as part of this document that helps define, again, where we are with Nefio today and where we want to go. So that's a discussion we entertain privately for now. I don't think in the next 7 minutes we can necessarily go deeper into that, but it's just to share that we're also thinking, so in the working group one, long-term roadmap and architecture, we're also thinking along these lines, right? How to condense and share these messages with well-defined documents. So I'll pause here. Bernard, I see you're on the call. I don't know if you want to add something there. Else, I'll open up for questions.
Just one additional comment here. If you imagine that sort of we are now sort of asking all the user story owners to define the components and the APIs, etc., in order to prevent that, we are sort of developing sort of non-matching architectural setups. It would be helpful to have this overall picture and reuse those components which have been defined in a common document. So that's one of the reasons why we believe that it might be helpful to have this framework in place to understand what elements would we be using when describing the user stories and the interfaces, etc.
Thanks. Yeah, exactly. And Wim, I see your comment. Some of these things we might already have today. Go ahead, Wim.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, like the APIs and stuff like that is in, so there is a single repo where all the APIs are present. And of course, when we do, and that's why I think a release still remains important as a vehicle to keep consistency between them, because at the end of the day, they all have to work together, right? And that's part of what we are trying to do when we do a release, is that each of these user story have, in theory, their individual impact on these elements. And part of doing a release is making sure that that they are consistent and aligned. So that is, for me, the source of truth for all of this. And the docs that we are building as part of a release is actually the result of that change and the new versions that we come from, right? So that's Now, whether it's accessible in the way that we want and stuff like that. For example, our APIs, they are actually, I think, Bala, you are uploading them to, so there is this tool in Kubernetes that basically uploads it. So it basically gives you every parameter with the explanations and stuff like that. So that is, people from the outside can actually see what are all the, let's say, artifacts and how they work as part of this, right? So I'm not sure what we want to reflect in yet another document, because I think
no, it's so
the release should be that vehicle as far as I can tell.
I wouldn't
the
agree.
intention.
Sorry to say, I wouldn't agree. So exactly how do I sort of position the capabilities of the Nephew project in the processes? I don't see that in the currently existing documents. If I would be asking what kind of functional components does Nephew consist of, and how does it interact with the external world? I don't know currently the documentation where I could see that easily. So I'm not saying that there is no information, but I believe that the way we are depicting that information could be much more easily accessible for anyone who's coming from the outside and who wants to adapt the solutions here. And that's why I believe sort of trying to streamline that to a certain degree would make sort of also external communication much easier.
Yeah, maybe if I may respond, I think, okay, so at the moment, our focus of Nephew has been, we are a little bit, so we have a Kubernetes API system, right? That is our, let's say, entry of it, right? We haven't fully focused on how besides with GitOps and stuff like that, how to consume it from the outside, but our API is basically the Kubernetes API. And there is, I mean, I think at the moment, as a release vehicle of Nephew, we are not focused on basically explaining what are all the mechanisms, how that API can be consumed. But, and I'm not sure whether who and whether that makes sense, but to do so. But if it makes sense, maybe that should be the focus. But at the end of the day, we are delivering a set of APIs that are part of a release, and there is various ways to interact with that, right? So if we really want to have more documentation on how that is consumable, okay, then we have to discuss that part, but it's not that they are not there.
Agreed.
Again,
And
please
go ahead,
continue.
Bernard.
No, I just want to emphasize, currently it's difficult for externals to understand how to use the APIs. So just imagine the interface between SMO and the Nephew capabilities. Yeah, sort of having sort of a depiction of the architecture of how the different elements sort of interact with one another is something which would be helpful for sort of applying and adopting the Nephew approach. If there's only a bunch of APIs and you can do whatever you like, basically this then doesn't scale well in the way of how we would communicate, because people would have to then do this investigation on their own, and will be probably confused about the option space which they have available.
So let's keep, if I may, let's keep this in mind. We're running out of time, and Tal have his hand raised. So right now, the intention was to just present these thoughts with the group, and Wim and Bernard, thank you for the various feedbacks we're gathering here. Right now, we're not saying let's act on this. Right now, this is more of a proposal, not something we need to act on, because right now we need to act on the scoping. But keep this in mind, because this is definitely something that once scoping is done, at least for the short term, this group can work on these documents or on that proposal. Tal, go ahead, and you'll have probably Tal the closing remark.
Yeah. So just a general additional thought in our mind. Not all the work that we do in SIG 2, 3, 4 comes from SIG 1. Quite a bit of work is done on just ongoing maintenance of our system, right? And with Porch now moving into Nephew, there's even more work there to maintain Porch. So I don't know how, if we want to capture it in these documentations for scope. I mean, there could be just a general point like maintenance work, or we can go into more detail to understand, what the scope is of the work that is planned in the other SIGs. I'm leaning on the second. I think it could be a good idea for SIG 1 to have more visibility on kind of big things that we're working on. I mean, it's all there in our task boards. We use them quite a lot on GitHub. But I don't know if we want it written down in the documents too, just to have an idea of how much work is being done.
Yes, sorry. How would you capture this? Like maintenance
And technical
debt.
Yeah.
I think Tal, that's what I meant by, you know, when SIG1 brings in a wish list, right? And the SIG2 has to consider these aspects as well, SIG2 and SIG3, about our regular maintenance activities along with the actual user stories. And then we had to go back to SIG1 and say, I'm not saying it's in those meetings, basically we had to figure out and negotiate what exactly can be fit into the release, because like you said, Tal, there are other things, internal maintenance things.
I would add SIG security there too, because they're really starting to build up requirements.
Yeah, so that's something I'm tracking already, security, and I'm working with them on identifying how they can bring their scope as part of a SIG1. So that's already in progress now.
Awesome. Yeah.
Okay, sorry, we're 1 minute over. I apologize for the working group leaders that we couldn't go through your updates. If there is anything that requires some help or some facilitation from the SIG chairs, please ping us on Slack. And with that, we're 1 minute over, so I'm going to get everyone go back to their day. Thank you very much for the discussion, and I think we're getting into the interesting territory where we're defining all the things for Nefio. So thanks all again.
Thanks, Alexis. Thanks,
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you, everybody.
Have a nice vacation.
Bye.
Thanks.
Yeah.
Yeah. Oh, thank you.